You know, when you look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the arguments can feel, well, just impossibly dense, right? So today, we're going to do something a little different. Our goal isn't to decide who's right or who's wrong. Instead, we're going to try and understand how each side builds its own reality. We're going to deconstruct the very architecture of their beliefs.
And that really is the fundamental question, isn't it? I mean, how can two groups of people look at the exact same history, the same piece of land, and walk away with two completely incompatible truths? How is that even possible?
Okay, so to get to the bottom of this, we have to go way deeper than just a simple timeline of events. We're going to have to become architects, in a way. We're going to need to look at the blueprints, the foundations, the support beams, everything that holds these powerful, clashing worldviews together. So let's grab our tools and get started.
All right, first up, the architecture of belief. Before we start digging in, we'll need a few key concepts to understand exactly how these structures are put together.
So our first tool is this idea of a belief lattice. I want you to picture a belief system not as a straight line of facts, but more like a spider's web. It's this intricate lattice where every single point, a historical claim, a moral value, a trusted source, is connected to and supports all the others. And the whole thing is held in place by what we can call trust anchors. These are the big, non-negotiable beliefs that everything else hangs on. You know, things like a sacred text, a defining historical moment, or a core moral principle.
Okay, real quick, before we dive in, it's worth pointing out that the framing of this conflict has changed over time. You'll see some arguments that early opposition was more of a pan-Arabic thing, not specifically Palestinian. But the counter-argument is that a distinct Palestinian identity was already forming and was then, well, forged in the trauma of the 1948 Nakba. For our purposes today, we're going to focus on how the conflict is understood now, as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
And finally, our last tool. At the very foundation of these belief lattices, you have our basic moral intuitions. Now, psychologists have identified 6 of them, and they group them into 2 types. You've got the individualizing foundations, care, fairness, and liberty. Then you've got the binding foundations, loyalty, authority, and purity, which are often emphasized to create really strong group bonds. Now, I need you to keep this distinction in your head, individualizing versus binding, because trust me, it is absolutely central to what comes next.
Section 2. Constructing the Israeli narrative. Okay, tools in hand, hard hats on, let's start examining the first structure, the Israeli narrative.
So how is this structure actually built? Well, its incredible strength comes from the fact that it uses all 6 of those moral foundations as its building blocks. This creates a super tight, cohesive framework. The binding foundations are the bedrock. You've got loyalty to the Jewish people, authority of tradition and state, and the purity or sacredness of the land itself. Then, built right on top of that, you have the individualizing foundations. Care is seen through the prism of never again. Liberty is the story of Zionism as a liberation movement, and fairness is the deep-seated belief that a state is deserved after millennia of persecution.
And resting on that moral bedrock are 4 core claims that lock together like puzzle pieces. It's a logical sequence. Step 1 is a claim to indigeneity, arguing a 3,000-year continuous connection to the land. That leads directly to Step 2, existential necessity, the idea that a sovereign state is the only guarantee against anti-Semitism. From there, the narrative moves to legal legitimacy, pointing to things like the Balfour Declaration and the UN Partition Plan. And all of this culminates in the 4th claim, that the Palestinian right of return isn't just a refugee issue, it's a demographic threat designed to end Jewish self-determination.
So when you put it all together, you get this incredibly powerful one-sentence summary. You see how those 4 claims aren't just a random list? They form a single, seamless story. Each piece reinforces the others, creating a narrative structure that is just incredibly stable and, well, resilient.
Okay, Section 3. Constructing the Palestinian narrative. Now let's turn our attention to the second structure. And what we're about to see is that the Palestinian narrative is built with a totally different architectural plan, resting on a whole different set of foundations.
The Palestinian narrative is built primarily on 3 main pillars, and you'll recognize these as those individualizing foundations we talked about. The central anchor, the main pillar, is liberty versus oppression. This is a story about a struggle for self-determination. The second is a justice anchor, fairness, specifically as a demand for restoration after the dispossession of 1948. And the third pillar is a trauma anchor, care versus harm, rooted in the collective trauma of the Nakba, which is seen not as a single event, but as an ongoing catastrophe.
Okay, so from those foundations, 5 core claims rise up, one after another, in a really clear sequence. It all starts with the claim of indigeneity.
that Palestinians are the native people who were the vast majority before 1948. From that starting point, Zionism is then framed as a settler colonial project. And if you believe that, then it follows that international plans like the UN partition were illegitimate. This in turn makes the right of return and the right to resist both legal and moral necessities. And finally, you get to the different political factions which are seen as simply the instruments for carrying out this liberation.
And once again, look at how this all synthesizes into one single idea. This isn't just a list of grievances. It is a powerful causal chain. One claim logically and morally leads to the next, building this incredibly strong narrative of injustice that creates a moral duty for restoration and resistance.
Section 4. The foundational clash. So here we are. We've built our two structures, and now we can see them standing side by side. And what's so striking is that both are internally coherent. Both make perfect sense on their own terms, but they are built from the ground up to be fundamentally, completely incompatible.
This table really strips the whole thing down to its absolute core. You see it, right? The Israeli narrative draws its power from those binding foundations: loyalty, authority, purity. It's a moral language of group survival. On the other hand, the Palestinian narrative draws its power from the individualizing foundations: liberty, fairness, care. It's a moral language of universal justice. The key takeaway here is that they aren't just telling different stories. They are literally speaking different moral languages.
So that's the big question, isn't it? If these two structures are so incompatible, how do they survive? How do they protect themselves from facts or arguments from the other side that should, in theory, knock them down? Well, the answer is a really powerful psychological defense mechanism. It's called the ultimate attribution error.
And it works like this. It's actually pretty simple. When my group does something, I explain it based on the situation. We had to do it, we had no choice, or we were just defending ourselves. But when their group does something, I explain it based on their fundamental character. They only act that way because that's just who they are, or they're just inherently malicious. Now listen, because this is the most important part. This cognitive bias, it's not a flaw in the system. It's a required feature. Think about it. For the Israeli narrative to remain intact, Palestinian actions must be seen as coming from an inherent desire for destruction. And for the Palestinian narrative to hold together, Israeli actions must be seen as the inevitable result of a settler colonial nature. If either side started seeing the other's actions as just a reaction to circumstances, their own entire belief structure would start to crumble.
And that leaves us with this central challenge. We've seen two complete, coherent, and morally powerful architectures of belief. They are designed from the ground up to be self-sealing and mutually exclusive. Understanding their structure doesn't solve the conflict, but it does reveal the true nature of the divide. And it leaves us with this final question. If both stories are coherent and complete on their own terms, how can a shared reality ever be built?